Hello and welcome to Handmade Originals. I'm in London, it's a beautifully sunny day and it's actually St Valentine's Day, so what better time to show you how to make some beautiful wedding garters. Now I've already shown you how to make garters for a ball gown, big frilly garters, and I've also shown you how to make flat garters which can be worn under any sort of gown at all, but particularly are useful if you're wearing a mermaid or very fitted dress. The garter I'm going to show you today, or actually three garters I'm going to show you today, are all hybrid garters, and what that means is that they are flat on one side, the bit in between your legs, and they have a focus of flamboyance, or whatever you want to call it, on the other side. So they are not the same all the way round, and they can have as bigger or smaller focus as you like. So it could be something like this, or it could be something quite flat to the leg, depending on what sort of dress you're going to wear it under. Now, first things first, you need to measure your leg. As I've pointed out in my previous videos, you need to measure your leg in the correct place, and the correct place for measuring your leg, I'm going to climb on the table, is about here, not up here, where your leg is widest, but where you also have quite a good slope straight down to here. If you fit it here, A, it's going to rub against your other leg, and B, it's on a slippery slope downwards, and you want it to be in the narrower part of your leg, which is straighter, which is here, which is about, I suppose, a hand's length. I could measure it, but it's different for everybody. So about a hand's length above the knee here, where it's comfortable. Now once you've measured your leg, the next thing you have to do is build a really good foundation, because anything you're going to create needs to have a very good foundation, especially a hybrid garter actually, because it will be slightly lopsided in the sense that, not on your leg, but in the sense that it will have some decoration on one side that it won't have on the other. So you want to make sure that you have a strong enough piece of elastic going round that it keeps it level on your leg, and of course that it doesn't slip. So I am going to try to use, or in fact I'm not going to try, I am going to use this newly discovered silicone backed gripper tape, which is elastic, but it has this silicone wavy line which gives it extra traction. Because it gives it extra traction, you don't need to have it quite so tight on the leg. Right, we're going to do a little bit of arithmetic here. My leg is 16 inches in circumference. So because the grippiness on the leg is a combination of traction, which is what this has in spades, and the tightness, this silicone backed elastic doesn't have to be as tight as a garter made with knicker elastic. Consequently, instead of cutting it back as much as I did for the frilly garter, which is this one with ordinary knicker elastic on the inside, I'm only going to cut this 1 inch shorter than my leg circumference. So I'm going to cut this to 15 inches. The ribbon, and everything is done by reference to the leg circumference, the ribbon I'm going to cut at 1 1/4 times the leg circumference. Now my leg is, as I said, 16. Quarter of 16 is 4. 16 plus 4 is 20. So that's 1 1/4 times the length of my leg circumference. And if I sew it together with those measurements, this is what it ends up looking like. And this has been put together with exactly those measurements. If I take out the, say, 1/2 inch each end for the seam allowance, you can see it will, so it goes to 16. That is what it will look like on the leg. If you would like your hybrid garter to be a little bit frillier than that, obviously you can make the ribbon slightly longer. So the frilly garter would have had 1 1/2 times the length of the leg circumference. So that would take it to 24, which is the 16 inches plus half, which is 8 there. Now, if all of this arithmetic is making your head explode, the thing to do is get a piece of ribbon, cut it to the length of whatever your leg circumference is. So supposing you've got an odd number. Supposing your leg circumference is 21, to work out 1¼ times 21, you just, okay, so fold it in half, half again, that's 1/4. One length was 21, plus 1/4 takes you up to, I don't know if you can see there on the camera, 26. So that's how you can do it without having to do any arithmetic at all. Right, having got your dimensions, you then want to sew up all of your flat ribbon first. So if I'm going to do 2 layers, which I am for this particular garter, I'm going to sew these ribbons together first, just as a flat piece of fabric, and I'm not going to attach it to the elastic until I have sewn all of the flat work on here. I am not going to attach my fancy bit of fandango focus until the garter is put together. So step 2 is do all of your sewing on your flat ribbon, and step 3 will be attach it to the elastic. Right, when you attach it to the elastic, this is a really important thing, so I'm going to zoom you right in close. Right. When you attach the ribbon to the elastic, after you've done all of your other sewing, you have to sew it with the silicone side up, because the silicone side has such traction that if you sew it like this, as you try to pull it through, it sticks. It will stick to your feed dog plate underneath your sewing machine. For the same reason, you have to make sure that your foot, and I would use a zipper foot like this. I'm going to turn this around so you can see more clearly. You mustn't sew with your foot on the silicone, because that will also pull, which means that it will kind of start to stretch and you'll get this. The way you have to sew it is so that you use this side of I'll do it this way around so you can see it more clearly. You have to put it under your machine using the zipper foot, using this side, so that you just have the zipper foot on the edge and not going over the silicone at all, just alongside it here to hold it down. And that way it will sew down nice and flat, as opposed to kind of doing this kind of thing, which is really tricky to deal with. To show you how to do that, because you just stretch it out, pin it here, there and there, and then stretch it as you sew. And as you sew it, of course, because this is when you do sew it, you use an ordinary straight stitch. You don't need to use a stretch stitch, because this is not going to stretch. So long as this is stretched out while you sew it, all the stretchy business is done. Right, I'm going to put these together and then I will come and show you how I've got on. You've done the tricky bit. This is the fun part. So here I've got 2 ribbons, one on top of the other, one satin, one grosgrain, and I've got my silicone backed elastic on the back. Here I've got 2 satin ribbons, which, as you can see from the stitching, did slip a little bit, but actually it doesn't matter, because once it's on the leg it won't show. And then this lovely piece of ribbon, which is a combination of satin and net, and the white that you can see behind it is actually just the other side of the elastic. They've all got the silicone backed elastic, so I'm just going to be very interested to see how this works out. Right, it's playtime now. Now we are going to decorate with our focal point. Let's start with this one. I found this brooch in a local charity shop, and I've cut, this was the bar that was on the back of it, I've cut that off, and I've used a metal file to just shave that down a bit, so it's nice and smooth on the back now. And I'm going to put that on here like that. Now, I could leave it like that, which I think is very simple, very elegant, and if you had, say for example, a very fitted dress, that might suit you perfectly. But I'm going to go a little bit more elaborate than that. So what I've done is I've got these gold ribbons, which I've cut into 3 pieces. I think I've cut, let me just see, one slightly longer than the other 2, but it doesn't really matter that much. Oh yeah, this is the slightly longer one. This keeps pinging. Right, so what I'm thinking of doing for this one is putting like a bow with 2 tails there, another one with 2 tails, one above the other, so, sorry, like that, and another one like that. This is all down to personal taste and what you like, and then I'm going to put the brooch in the middle like that, and I think that looks really pretty. I do think, however, it might look a little bit leggy, so what I might do is make these all a bit smaller, a bit tighter, and make the tails a bit shorter. And I think that for this sort of thing you want a sort of 1/3, 2/3 balance of the bow. So I think I'm happy with that. I'm going to sew these bits in here together, and I'm going to put a little bit of glue on the back of this diamante. And then I'm also, because if you look at this carefully, you can see there are gaps in between these glass stones. So I'm going to put a couple of stitches, try to keep it in front of the camera, I'm going to put a couple of stitches in to secure that as well. And then I think that will be good to go. I was thinking that maybe I could put in a bit more ribbon, perhaps going this way, and put that over the top. And the trick here is just to play with it and stop when you're ready, always bearing in mind the old adage that less is more. So if you get to a point where you think actually that's too much, take off the last thing that you put on. I might put that in actually, we'll see. I'll see what it looks like when it's all sewn together. Also, of course, this is somewhere where you can put in something meaningful that has some resonance with your bride-to-be, or a sort of family heirloom or something, just something, or something funny, you know, just something that will make your bride smile or be thrilled or be even a bit emotional and moved. But anyway, so that's garter number 1. I'm going to sew all this together and then I'll come back to that one and show you when it's done. This is garter number 2, which is the 2 layers of ribbon. And just FYI, I will put a list of where I've got all my supplies from at the bottom of this video underneath, but most of the ribbon here is actually from chocolate boxes and things like that. If ever I see a pretty ribbon, I always just sort of roll it up as if I'm still in World War II or something, and I keep it. But I just think they're the sort of perfect length, and you don't need sort of, I don't know, our local store now has, you have to buy the whole reel if you want to buy a piece of ribbon, whereas actually I usually only want a bit about this length. Anyway, so I digress. So on this one, what I'm thinking here is I'm going to put some flowers on this one, which I think looks quite pretty, but perhaps not just like that. I'm going to put some leaves in as well. Now, if you want to make up silk flowers, I have done a video ages ago on exactly how to do that, and I'll put a link to that up here. But in the meantime, these are actually little hair clips that you can see. And what I've done is just cut the clip off here. And I've cut it by just cutting the glue, being very careful not to cut the petals. Although if you do cut the petals, it's not the end of the world, because roses in the garden are not perfect. They've all, you know, got some slight deviation from perfection. Now, one thing you will notice about this, and you might notice it on your roses or whatever other flowers you use, is that this has a hole here. And I don't know if you can see the needle that comes out here. So that is the mechanism by which, if there was a little plate across the bottom here, this is all held together. Now, I don't want all of this to come apart. on the bride's wedding day. So what I'm going to do, in fact I'll show you, I've done it here, is I've stitched the double stitch on the back of this one here. I've gone through the hole and I've put, can you see a little bead in there? A bead there, and then I've come back and I've done another double stitch here. I've left that attached because I'm going to use that thread to attach it to this ribbon. But that little bead there will keep this rose intact and stop it falling apart, even though I have taken the back of it off. Now, so these 3 roses I think look very pretty, but I think that's maybe not enough. So what I'm going to do, I think, is put in maybe some leaves like this, one there, and you might remember these from previous videos where I've considered using them, and I want to use them, but I haven't found a way of doing it. Anyway, so I quite like these all together. Like, I think that looks really pretty. So I'm going to take the clips off the back of these to make them flatter on the garter. I'm going to sew them on, and I think I'm going to use these leaves. But the problem with these leaves is that if that's the garter there, it's going to do that. So it needs some sort of support to keep it upright when it's on the leg. And initially I was thinking I would use a bit of stiff white net or something like that, but then I thought, well, that's going to be pretty uncomfortable against the leg. And then I had a brainwave, and my brainwave was, what has a really good support but is as light as a feather, but a feather. So what I've done is I've taken a feather which is roughly the same shape as that leaf. I've cut out the bits that would stick out, and I was going to cut the whole thing off so I would just have this central, I think it's called a rachis, that central part of the feather there. So I could just have that as sort of like scaffolding to hold this up. But then I thought, actually, if I put this on top like that, it will hold it up, but it also looks quite nice with this sort of little frondy bits. I don't think that's the technical term. These little fluffy bits sticking out. So I think I'm going to do that and put that under there like that. And then I'm going to get another feather to support this piece here, and again leave these little fluffy bits out, which I think will sort of fill it in a bit as well. And then I think I'll leave it at that. I might just sew a couple of little pearl beads here and there, but actually I quite like that. I think that's quite simple and pretty. Again, less is more. So if you want to know how to cut a feather, basically what you do is you just get your small Stanley knife and you start at the top, hold the top end and just run down the side of the rachis, as we now know it to be called, down to where you get to the fluffy bits, and then you can literally just take those pieces away and do the same thing on the other side. And the central part forms a nice little wall for you to push the blade against, and then you take those out, and there you have it. You've got your, which incidentally is how you have all the fancy hats, and you can see it better like that. And then you can use that feather, you can either stitch it on or glue it on behind, oops, getting tangled up here, behind this leaf here like that. And you can leave the little tail bit on as well if you like. I think that's quite cute, a bit different. Anyway, I'm going to put all of that together, and really this is just to give you an idea of different combinations and perhaps different thoughts or different ways of tackling it, like feathers that you might not have considered, which are lightweight, they're not scratchy on the skin, as long as you're not allergic to feathers. And I think quite nice. Obviously one would prefer to take naturally fallen feathers, not feathers which are plucked, but that's a matter for you and your conscience. Right, the third and final hybrid garter. I'm just going to move these out of the way. I will come back and show you when that's finished, and that's this one. Again, this is This is a ribbon from a chocolate box, and the white that you can see behind it is actually the garter elastic, which I just sewed centrally over this central band, so that it would give me an extra bit of white, because I'm going to put white decoration on top, and this is what I'm going to do. Now, I don't know if you know, I used to make costumes, and every now and then I would have to buy things for costumes, and you can buy these really lovely little sprays of feathers, which are basically just feathers which have been glued together. So if you get lots of tiny little feathers, get a blob of glue, put it on some baking paper, and then just slot them all in, then you'll end up with a nice little spray of feathers like that. And what I'm going to do, or in fact what I've done, is I have got 2 of these like that. I think I'm going to put a blob of glue, but also a couple of stitches here. And then for my central piece, I've got a piece of diamante, which again is from a charity shop. This was a brooch. I've taken the brooch mechanism off. I've rubbed it down, as you can see. That's now flat on the back, and again it has gaps in between the stones, so that I can glue that down a little bit, and then I can put some stitches over it just to keep it in place. Now, to put these little beads on here, what I did was I got these are some very ancient beads from someone who used to make clothes in the 1930s. And I've had these for years and never quite knew what to do with them. And this actually was the perfect solution. So what I did was I threaded a few of them on a needle. I ran a tiny, tiny line of glue, and then I put the beads just so that they were touching the line of glue. And then when I felt they were drying, I pulled the needle out. So I didn't get any glue on the needle. I just got it on the edge of the beads. And actually I'm really pleased with the way it's come out, because if you'd stitched over and over them, I think that the stitching would be much more visible. And this I am really pleased with, because I'm sort of looking at it thinking, is it bridal or is it burlesque? And I think it falls on the bridal side of that scale. If you have a different point of view, please let me know what you think. I'd be very interested in your view of all or any of these different garters. Right, so I'm now going to put all of them together, and I will bring them all back to show you when I'm finished. So this particular garter, I decided I wasn't actually happy with the combination of colours that we have here, because this lilac to me doesn't exactly clash with this rose, but it doesn't tone in. And I think it's because this particular rose and the other two have shades of peach, which is sort of yellow in it, and this absolutely doesn't. So what I did at the last minute was change my mind completely. I got rid of this ribbon. So I substituted these ribbons which have shades of yellow in them. This is a cream satin ribbon and this is a blue satin ribbon, but you might think, well, where's the shade of yellow in, or the tone of yellow in that? But if I put this blue next to it, perhaps that makes it clearer, because this one then looks a little bit slightly green by comparison, but it's got that slightly yellow tone in it anyway. So then I revisited the leaves that I was going to put with it, and I thought, actually, if I'm going to have cream satin ribbon, I should really have not white, but sort of a creamy colour. So what I then did was I stained these leaves with tea, and I am much happier with that combination. And my only other reservation is that I think this might be too long. So I think what I'm going to do is either overlap them a bit more to make it a bit smaller on the leg here, so that you can actually see the whole thing from the front, rather than having it kind of going round the leg, which is, I think, too much. Right, I'm going to play with this and I'll come back and show you all three when I've finished. I'll explain how I got to this arrangement when I review all of the final garters, but I just want to say, if you have a big arrangement like this that you're trying to put on a garter, then assemble it first, not on here, so that it's one piece, and then stretch out your garter to the length it will be, plus a little bit for hem allowance, seam allowance, and then you can safely sew this on, knowing that when it's on the leg that the leaves won't all kind of separate like that because you've sewn it in different places. The next thing is, I've fiddled about with this quite a lot, working out where my roses are going to go. When you've got a satisfactory arrangement, take a photo, and then you can take them off and sew them on piece by piece, safe in the knowledge that you don't need to remember where they were going, because you've got your little photograph you can refer to make sure they all go back in the right place. Now I'm just going to sew this on, and then I'll come back and I'll explain what happened with this one, and I'll show you the other two. Right, before we get to the pretty picture bit at the end, I just want to quickly review some of the things I've learned using this silicone backed elastic, which I think really bears repeating, and which I think is useful information if you're going to use it in any of your garters. So the first thing I would say is, when you're cutting your silicone backed elastic, the length you want to cut it to is, as we've said in the video, your leg circumference minus 1 inch. The ribbon length, I've said initially, I think 1 1/4 times your leg circumference. I would say that's actually, from doing these various garters, the minimum length that you want your ribbon to be. And in fact, I would suggest that even if you want it that minimum length, that I would add on an extra inch, and I'll tell you why. Because if you have a look here, this silicone elastic is brilliant but tricky to work with, because it's very difficult to finish it nicely. So if you have an extra bit of ribbon which is longer, so start the elastic a little bit down, so you've got enough ribbon to go over the edge like that, so that you finish it nicely on the inside. The other thing I would say about the silicone backed elastic is, when you come to sew your garter together, sew it by hand, because if you put that under the machine, this side is going to be under your needle on your foot, and this side is going to be on your presser plate. So both of them are going to be fighting with the machine. So if you just do it by hand, that's a much easier and actually quicker way of doing it. Otherwise it's just going to be sticking there, not wanting to go through. So the other thing I have learned using this is, each time, look at this, each time you sew this elastic, it stretches. So you must complete your flat work first if you're putting 2 ribbons together, and then just sew it with 1 line of sewing on each side onto the silicone backed elastic. The other thing is, look, I think it shows really well here, if you use a tiny stitch, that also really stretches the silicone backed elastic. You see this side, it's a bigger stitch, so it hasn't stretched, whereas this side, it's got a complete curve. That's actually a straight bit of silicone backed elastic. So what I would suggest, I used, I think, 1.5 stitch, so I wouldn't use less than that. Certainly don't go below that at all. The other thing, if you're a bit lazy like me, to attach this ribbon, I very quickly just used double-edged tape, sticky tape, and I think you can see that if you put that in, it doesn't ruche up properly because it's so sticky, it's trying to hold it flat. Whereas this bit, obviously, because it's only got 1 ribbon, doesn't have any double-backed sticky tape, and it does stretch nicely, and it ruches up nicely. So I would definitely not use, however convenient it is, do not use the double-sided sticky tape. Just do it the old-fashioned way, and either, we call it tacking, in America they call it basting, with just a big running stitch to hold it in place, and then whip it under your machine and do it Other thing, when you're look at this silicone backed elastic, it's brilliant, but you do have to get a different head on. Well, as I showed you earlier on in the video, you have to use a zipper foot so that you can keep the foot to the side of the silicone, and you sew up the edge of the elastic. You don't sew over the silicone or have the foot anywhere near the silicone, because it will just keep sticking all the time, and you won't get a nice smooth seam. I've said use, I've made notes here because there are so many things to remember. I've said use the 1.5 or 1.5 stitch. The smaller the stitch, the more it stretches. Apart from all of these caveats, my conclusion about the silicone backed elastic is it's brilliant. So I'm going to just finally show you the result of all my labours. Here we are. This is garter number 1. This is grosgrain ribbon with satin ribbon on top. All of these garters have the silicone backed elastic in them. This is another ribbon on top, satin with a gold edge, which I think looks very pretty. And this is a piece of diamante which I got from a charity shop. It was a brooch which I've broken down, and you don't need to use the whole thing. You could, I think there were some other bits down here which I just cut off because I thought this looked better. And I'm really pleased with the way that's turned out. As far as glue is concerned, I don't like using glue generally, because if you're going to also stitch, it's very difficult to put a needle through a piece of dried glue. The other thing I would say is I would strongly suggest you don't use a hot glue gun, largely because when glue comes out of a hot glue gun, in my experience, it tends to go bleh, and you get much more than you intended. So I just use a small tube of all-purpose glue. This is Bostik, which I suppose is a well-known brand. It doesn't have to be this, it can be any glue, I'm not promoting it. But you want a small tube of glue with a small nozzle so that you can really control the flow of the glue and how much you're going to put on your garter. Right, that's number 1. Number 2 is this one, which I have to say I'm really pleased with. I was a bit concerned it was going to be a bit more a bit too sort of burlesque rather than bridal, but actually I'm really pleased with it. And I think if your bride has sort of 1920s theme going, this is absolutely perfect. Again, this is a piece of diamante from a piece of jewellery. I think that was also a brooch from a charity shop, so this is just glass, nothing special. These are feathers which have just been fanned out like this and then sort of glued together at the point. And then sewn on and with a tiny dab of glue underneath. And this has reinforcing stitching as well, because when you put the garter on, everything will stretch like this. So you need to be careful that you don't put too much glue, because if you do that and you're stretching under where the glue is, it can detach itself and then you end up with whatever you've put on here as your fabulous focal point dropping to the floor. Right, and this is ribbon, it's ribbon with a tiny bit of net either side, and I've placed the elastic so that a tiny bit of white is showing either side of this central ribbon part so that it picks up the white of the feathers. So that's number 2. And number 3 was a bit of a disaster. It was going to be this ribbon with the pink roses, but it just, I don't know, the colours of it just didn't look right to me. It looked horrible. So this is just something I've thrown together. This is not a final garter. This is just a bit of nonsense. So I just stuck something else on there to see if that would look all right. I still don't like it. I think it looks tacky. So that one's out. But this is garter number 3. And after all the trials and tribulations, I'm actually really thrilled with this. I think it's come out really well. And what I decided in the end was to, because I was really going to town on the embellishment, I kept the band going around the leg, the hybrid part of it, really plain. So this is just satin ribbon with the satin silicone backed elastic. These leaf parts, which are from a whole line of trim, I've just cut out the pieces that I wanted. I've also stained them with tea to give them a slightly antique-y feel. And the feathers, the ratchets, for which is holding up the structure of the leaf, they're also dyed with tea. These roses are from hair clips. I took the back off them, and so that they didn't fall apart, you'll remember I've just come through the back, put a tiny bead here, which glistens, I think, so even if that does pick up the light, that's fine. And that holds the rose in place, and these are sewn on, they're not glued. The feathers and the leaves are put together before I attached it to the ribbon, so that when you do this, I know that everything will stay together, because if I sewed it on separately, I think that you would find that when you put the garter on and stretched it to about there around the leg, you might find a few leaves disappearing around the back of your leg or something. Anyway, so here we are. These are the 3 garters. These are the 3 hybrid garters made with the silicone backed elastic, which I am getting fed up saying. Please pay attention to all the caveats I made earlier on about using the silicone backed elastic, because it is brilliant, but it does need a bit of careful handling. And let me know which one you prefer.